The muffled sound of rain against the high windows seemed to accompany every word that came out of the millionaire's mouth. He stood at the mahogany desk in the center of the office, his cell phone pressed to his ear, speaking in such a low tone that anyone would have had to lean in to hear what he said. His eyes didn't stay still. They roamed the room as if every corner might hide someone listening. A desk lamp, positioned at a precise angle, illuminated only part of his face, highlighting his clenched jaw and slightly arched brow. His voice was firm but charged with something almost invisible, the tension of someone revealing secrets or giving orders that cannot be written down. "No. This needs to be resolved today," he said, pausing only to hear the other end's response. The sound coming from the phone was distant and muffled, but anyone paying attention would hear the urgency. "No mistakes." "Got it." The silence that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. He exhaled, slowly, as if measuring each beat of his own heart, and then turned slightly to look out the window, watching the city lights reflected in the wet glass. In the hallway, delicate but hurried footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. The imaginary camera would shift focus to the closed door, revealing a shadow approaching, growing larger by the second. Her hand, feminine and delicate, appeared first, balancing a silver tray with a steaming cup and a small plate. She breathed deeply, perhaps from the weight of the tray, perhaps from the strange sensation she always felt when approaching that office. The air inside had a different weight, as if each piece of furniture, each painting on the wall, held stories that could not be told. The millionaire, still with his cell phone to his ear, glanced at the door before it even opened. A flash of alert crossed his face. His previously firm voice lost its cadence for a second. "I'll talk to you later," he murmured, and hung up the phone before the other person could respond. He stood there, his hand still holding the receiver, as the door slowly opened. She entered with measured steps, her impeccable uniform molding her curves, her blonde hair tied in a bun that let a few strands escape at the nape of her neck. Her blue eyes lingered on him for a moment, as if searching for signs that her visitor was welcome. She placed the tray on the side table near the armchair, but she couldn't help but notice how his gaze followed her, attentive to every movement. It was a look that wasn't limited to the formality of boss and employee. There was something more there, an invisible layer that thickened the air in the room. He hadn't moved yet. He just watched. The tray landed with a soft clink of porcelain against silver. She straightened her apron, and it was then that she realized his phone was still in his hand, but the screen was blank. There was no conversation going on, just that silence that stretched between them, heavy and charged with meaning. "Did I interrupt something?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling like each word echoed louder than it should have in the confined space. He gave a quick, almost imperceptible smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing that couldn't wait," he replied, tucking his cell phone into his jacket pocket with a gesture too slow to be innocent. She noticed. Of course she did. Not just the gesture, but the way he looked away immediately afterward, as if the simple exchange of glances might reveal more than he wanted to reveal. For a moment, she considered turning and leaving, but there was something about that man that always kept her there longer than it should have. He took 2 steps toward her, the sound of his polished soles echoing on the floor. With each step, the distance closed, and the faint scent of his expensive perfume mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. When he stopped, he was close enough for her to feel the vibration of his presence. "You're always on time," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like both praise and warning. The sentence hung in the air, ambiguous, difficult to decipher. She tried to respond, but only smiled softly, as if that would be enough to end the moment. But he didn't move. Silence once again filled the room, and in that silence were questions no one dared ask. If you enjoy stories full of secrets, tension, and twists, leave a like now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters that will captivate you from beginning to end. Every detail counts, and you won't want to miss what comes next. He looked away for a moment, walking to the desk to pick up a leather folder. Opening it, he revealed some papers and discreetly, something that looked like a photograph. She tried not to look, but she couldn't help it. For a moment she swore she saw her own face in that photo, younger, in a place she didn't recognize. His hand covered the picture before. She could be sure. He closed the folder and said simply, "We have a lot to talk about. Have you ever felt like someone knew more about you than they should?" The door moved slowly, creaking almost imperceptibly, but enough to shatter the calculated silence of the room. The light from the hallway entered in a narrow beam, illuminating only the thin line of the polished wooden floor before revealing the figure of the maid. She carried an impeccably organized tray, a steaming cup of coffee, and some documents neatly stacked beside it, as if part of a routine rehearsed countless times. Her footsteps were light, almost inaudible, but the simple act of appearing in that moment when it wasn't hers changed the entire mood of the room. His back was to the door, leaning against the mahogany desk, speaking into the phone in a low, controlled, yet intense voice. The words came quickly, measuredly, as if each one were handpicked to leave no unnecessary traces. However, the moment her silhouette crossed the threshold, something in him abruptly changed. The conversation, until then steady and focused, lost its rhythm. Mid-sentence, he stopped. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound, but a sharp cut, as if the room's breath had been interrupted. Slowly he turned, and in that movement tension took shape. His gaze, previously fixed on some distant point in space or imagination, met hers. It was a silent shock, a meeting of two worlds that shouldn't have intersected at that moment. His eyes held something beyond surprise. There was a weight of warning, as if he were measuring her every reaction, trying to calculate whether this moment would be harmless or disastrous. She, in turn, froze for a split second. The tray, held steady in her hands, suddenly felt heavier. Steam from the coffee rose in slow spirals, mingling with the invisible tension that filled the air. There were no words, only the distant sound of a clock ticking away, seconds that seemed to last for entire minutes. The contrast between them was stark. He, the absolute master of that space, of time, and even of the invisible rules that governed it, now seemed vulnerable, not in his body, but in his gaze. She, who had always moved behind the scenes, accustomed to being unnoticed, now became the center of his attention, as if her mere presence there were an event requiring maximum vigilance. The small details that would normally go unnoticed came to life in that instant. The almost imperceptible movement of his fingers closing more tightly around the tray, the way he tilted his head slightly, never taking his eyes off her, perhaps trying to decipher if what he carried was just coffee and papers, or something more. The air was heavy, but not with heat, but with the feeling that there was more being communicated in that silence than any words could say. She took another step inside, and that was enough for him to push away from the table, straightening his posture as if trying to regain some lost control. His hand, still holding the phone, tightened its grip until his knuckles turned slightly white. But he didn't speak again. The person on the other end of the line was put on hold, forgotten for what seemed like endless seconds. What was unfolding there wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a clash of presences, a moment in which both, in different ways, realized they were in new territory. She, feeling watched as never before, tried to maintain a neutral expression, as if nothing were different from all the other times she'd entered that space. He, on the other hand, knew the interruption was unwelcome, not because it was untimely, but because there was something he didn't want her to witness, something that perhaps was already partially revealed in the air, in the expressions, and in the suspended tone of the interrupted conversation. Their gaze lingered longer than any social etiquette would allow. There was no rush to break eye contact, and that only made it more intense. It was as if they were challenging each other wordlessly, she with the firmness of someone who knows she's on alien territory but doesn't feel inferior, he with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling all variables and now faced with an unpredictable one. What would happen next depended on who moved first, and deep down, they both knew. That moment had already changed something. If it were you, would you stay to find out more, or leave before it was too late? The silence that fell was so dense it felt weighty. He didn't hang up the phone immediately. There was a short, almost imperceptible pause, but charged with intention. His hand, previously relaxed, pressed the receiver lightly to his ear, and his gaze drifted to a fixed point on the floor, as if calculating the exact moment to end the call. When he finally hung up, it was abrupt, without the usual formalities, as if the conversation had been cut short before its natural end. There was no goodbye or talk to you later, just a sharp click that echoed through the room with more force than it should have. She noticed. It didn't take much to understand that she had walked into the middle of something important, perhaps delicate, perhaps dangerous, but she pretended not to notice. She pretended she was just passing by, that the encounter was casual, that she hadn't sensed the charged air that enveloped that moment. Still, the awareness of the moment etched itself on her like a brand, and each second seemed to drag on with a silent echo. He took a deep breath, an almost imperceptible gesture, and then took a step toward her. It wasn't just any step. It had rhythm, it had weight, and the way his feet hit the ground conveyed more than just physical movement. There was something to be said, or something to be hidden. The distance between them narrowed, and every centimeter stolen by his advance seemed to further compress the air, separating them. His eyes sought hers, but not directly. It was a testing, probing look, as if trying to gauge how far she was willing to go or how much she had already perceived. He stopped less than a meter away, and in that reduced space their breaths mingled. His body was leaning forward slightly, as if about to reveal something, but the tension in his jaw betrayed that perhaps he was, in fact, about to recalculate his words, filter them, or shape them according to his own needs. She, for her part, maintained a neutral posture, her arms slightly crossed, not as a barrier but as a subtle protection, a nearly invisible shield that signaled she was ready to listen or to retreat. The surroundings seemed to have vanished. There were no more street sounds, no more noises from the house, only silence filled with anticipation. It was a moment of borderline. He could break through this barrier and expose something he was carrying, or he could divert the subject with the same mastery of someone who knows how to bury secrets. He moved his lips as if to speak, but the sentence didn't come immediately. It was as if the very choice of words were a weapon, and he knew any slip-up could reveal more than he intended. In that narrow space of indecision, the silence wasn't empty. It was alive, pulsating. Almost a third character in the scene, watching them both attentively. She didn't blink. She wanted to see how far he would go. His second step didn't come, and that said more than any confession could. The game was clear. What was at stake wasn't just what he knew, but what she could discover on her own. And it's at this point that I ask you, if I were you, would you remain silent to see how far he would go, or would you break the tension and ask what he was hiding? The room seemed calm at first glance, but a closer look revealed something out of place. The table, though organized, held a collection of papers that didn't seem to belong there. They weren't ordinary documents, at least not in the ordinary sense of the word. There were handwritten notes, scribbled in haste, and among them an open envelope, turned so that the contents couldn't be seen immediately. Beside it, an object partially hidden under a leather folder, perhaps purposefully, as if to go unnoticed by the most inattentive eye. But she wasn't inattentive. A quick movement of her eyes, and she was already registering every detail, every arrangement that didn't fit with the harmony of the rest of the room. She didn't stare for long, knowing that lingering might give her away. So she looked away as if simply admiring the space, feigning interest in the furniture and books. But he noticed. His subtlety was too refined to miss such a brief gesture. And in that instant, something in the air shifted. An almost imperceptible tension settled, as if the space between them had narrowed, even though they hadn't moved. He didn't ask any direct questions, didn't point anything out, just tilted his head slightly, studying her, as if gauging how far she would dare to go. "Did you like the decor?" he asked, his tone casual but carrying a hint of hidden curiosity. "It's interesting," she replied, choosing each word as if she were walking on glass. The exchange was brief, but there was more than the words revealed. It was as if beneath the banal phrases there was a code, a subtext laden with intention and suspicion. He knew she had seen. She knew he knew. But neither of them was willing to break their disguise any time soon. The more exchange was like a silent chess match, where every move was calculated not only to advance, but also to confuse the opponent. His gaze returned briefly to the papers, as if to confirm they were exactly as he'd left them. Then he returned to her with a brief, restrained smile, which seemed more like a silent warning than a gesture of sympathy. She, in turn, remained calm, even though she sensed that their interaction had opened a dangerous game. From that moment on, every word, every gesture, every silence carried weight. As she tried to maintain her composure, she felt her mind racing. The open envelope might contain something that explained that air of secrecy and the hidden object. That might be the key to everything, but how could she be sure without exposing herself? At the same time, his reaction showed that this wasn't a simple oversight. He wanted to know how far she would dare to explore. He wanted to gauge her curiosity, perhaps even provoke her. The next few seconds were shrouded in a strange calm, as if they had both made a silent agreement not to mention what was implied. He diverted the subject to something trivial, but his intonation kept the tension in the air. She responded in kind, showing no signs of nervousness, but without losing control of her own attention. It was as if they were walking a fine line, balancing between the obvious and the hidden. Every detail of the previously neutral environment now seemed like a potential bearer of secrets. Vishal. Arrangement of the books, the way some drawers were closed and others left ajar, the calculated weight of the pauses between one line and the next. Nothing seemed random. He was too comfortable for someone who had just been observed like this. Maybe because he was in control, or maybe because he was interested in her finding out, but only to a point. The tension was rising not because of what was being said, but because of what remained unspoken. And deep down, she knew she had crossed an invisible boundary. No matter how brief her glance at the table had been, she was now part of that secret, even if she didn't yet fully understand it. He knew it too, and this shared, unspoken awareness was what made the atmosphere so dense. And if you were in her place, would you keep up the game of disguises to find out more, or would you force the situation to the point of getting the truth out of him before it was too late? He goes from serious to a calculated, almost rehearsed smile, as if every muscle in his face is obeying an internal command, rather than a genuine impulse. It's a sudden transformation, almost too abrupt to be natural, and precisely for that reason, it draws more attention than it relieves. He had entered the room with a firm posture, a controlled voice, and a look filled with something bordering on absolute tension, and now, in a matter of seconds, he seems to be trying to reshape the entire mood of the conversation. The movement is quick, but not imperceptible. The kind of transition that only convinces those who want to be deceived. He offers a gesture he's rarely, or perhaps never, made before. He carefully pulls out her chair for her to sit in, as if suddenly a host concerned for her comfort. The soft sound of the wood scraping against the floor contrasts with the charged energy that dominated the space seconds ago. It's as if he's painting a new scene, trying to replace the colors of tension with softer tones, but the still fresh paint reveals what's beneath. Then, without hesitation, he offers her coffee. The strong aroma quickly permeates the air, creating an almost intimate atmosphere, but she senses something in his tone, a slight pressure to accept, that betrays a motive beyond hospitality. It's as if the simple act of serving is, in fact, an attempt to reposition the conversation in a field where he has the upper hand. Then, as if to complete the picture, he asks something personal. It's not invasive enough to feel threatening, but intimate enough to force an emotional shift. It could be about family, a detail from childhood, or a memory he knows will bring her back to a specific moment. The way he chooses the topic, the way he tilts his head slightly and maintains eye contact, all indicate that it's not just curiosity. It's strategy. He wants to push her to more vulnerable ground, but in a way that feels like an act of genuine connection. She, however, is not ready to be led. The change in tone is too abrupt to go unnoticed. Her mind works quickly, connecting the sequence of events. He enters with a serious, almost pressured air. Then, almost theatrically, he softens his face, changes the timbre of his voice, and offers gestures that clash with his previous demeanor. This is not simple kindness, it's a ploy. Perhaps he realized that the direct approach would lead him to an impasse, and now he tries a lateral approach, more seductive and less confrontational. But this contrast, rather than reassuring her, raises a red flag. Her ego at that moment rises almost imperceptibly as she feels she's seeing something he didn't want to show, the fragility behind the tactic. It's like facing an experienced player who's suddenly forced to improvise. This sensation makes her lean forward mentally, attentive to every nuance, not to surrender to his game, but to understand the cards he's afraid to reveal. The environment, once again, seems to react. The distant sound of footsteps in the hallway becomes more present. The light changes hue slightly as a cloud passes by the window, and all of this contributes to the almost cinematic atmosphere of the scene. Should she accept or decline the coffee? Should she answer the personal question or return it with another? She knows that whatever she chooses, she'll be treading on a minefield, but she's also aware that, at this moment, he's the one truly under pressure. And this silent shift in power is something she wants to explore. If you were in her shoes, would you accept the coffee and play along, or would you refuse to show that you won't let yourself be manipulated? The conversation began with the naturalness of two strangers forced to interact, exchanging short sentences, observing more than actually speaking. At first, there was an invisible barrier between them, a wall of formality that kept every word measured, every gesture controlled. But as the conversation progressed, something imperceptible began to shift. The stiffness gave way to longer pauses, to glances that lingered a little longer than necessary. It wasn't just the content of the words that mattered now, but the tone, the intonation, and the way each seemed to lean subtly toward the other. Every micro-expression was registered and interpreted, as if both were, consciously or not, deciphering a silent code forming between them. There was an almost imperceptible physical closeness, as if a magnetic field drew them together without them realizing it. Small gestures became charged with meaning, the way he tilted his body slightly to hear better, the way she let out a restrained, almost complicit smile. The surrounding sound seemed muffled, as if the rest of the room had decided to retreat to allow this moment to unfold without interference. It was when he, in a simple gesture, extended his hand to hand her something, a document, a pen, perhaps an object without any objective importance, that the barrier was broken. His fingers lightly brushed hers, and the shock wasn't physical but internal, a brief, almost accidental touch, but one that carried an unexpected energy. There was nothing overt, nothing that could be accused of clear intention, but in that instant, they both knew something had changed. Her eyes sought his almost reflexively, and what she found there wasn't just courtesy or politeness. There was a subtle intensity, a silent spark, as if something had been awakened in that brief contact. He, in turn, held her gaze for a second longer than he should have, and in that second a whole world of unspoken possibilities formed. There were no words to describe it, but the tension was palpable. It was a contradictory sensation, alluring and dangerous at the same time, as if they were on the verge of crossing a line they rationally knew they shouldn't cross. The body reacts before the mind comprehends. A slight increase in heart rate, a deeper breath, facial muscles that involuntarily soften the expression. He withdraws his hand. Calmly, unhurriedly, as if wanting to prolong that moment for a fraction of a second longer. She, in turn, keeps the object between her fingers, but her true attention is in the echo of that touch, which insists on lingering even after the physical contact has ended. For a moment, neither of them speaks. The silence isn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it feels charged, dense, as if each is trying to process what just happened without revealing too much. It's in this gap that the uncomfortable realization arises. This shouldn't be happening. Perhaps because of the context, the circumstances, or the unspoken codes they both knew. But at the same time, it was precisely this silent prohibition that made everything more intense. What's forbidden always carries a different flame, a feeling that every stolen second has a multiplied value. The conversation resumes, but it's not the same. There are slight changes in tone, a slightly slower pace, sentences that begin with more hesitation, as if each person were calculating how much to reveal. The words now carry subtexts that weren't there minutes ago. Even the pauses between sentences seem longer, as if each silence were actually a disguised exchange of glances. They both knew nothing concrete had been said or done. No promises, no confessions, no overtly compromising gestures. But the first spark had already been lit, and it was impossible to pretend they hadn't felt it. The silent game had begun, and although each tried to maintain composure, there was a part of them that, almost against their will, already wanted to know where this moment might lead. Have you ever felt like a simple touch could completely change the way you see someone? The sound came at first as a distant, almost indistinct murmur, but soon became clear enough to cut the air like a thin blade. It was a muffled voice, perhaps two, echoing in the narrow corridor, mingling with footsteps that seemed to lack a common rhythm. It wasn't the hurried cadence of someone running, nor the light pace of someone walking unhurriedly. It was a calculated advance, interrupted by small pauses, as if whoever was outside were orienting themselves to the sound coming from within. The effect was immediate. His gaze, until then fixed and focused, shifted with the precision of someone accustomed to measuring risks in seconds. There was no explanation, only movement. He took a step back, almost imperceptible, but charged with meaning, a strategic retreat, as if every inch of distance were a shield against the possibility of being seen together. His breathing changed, shorter, almost silent, as if even the air coming in and out could betray him. His face, previously turned toward you with the tension of someone wanting something to be understood, was now closed in absolute control. His fingers, which had only just touched documents or indicated points in the air, withdrew to his body, as if any gesture could be a betrayal. He knew there was little time. The sound in the hallway was approaching, bringing with it the feeling that the door was no longer a barrier, but an invitation. You realized he didn't just want to prevent anyone from seeing you together. He needed to. It was a move of self-preservation, but not in the simple sense of protecting himself. It was protecting a larger plot, something you might not yet have grasped. The silence between you grew dense, and in that density, you felt your own body go on alert. Your ears now picked up details that would have gone unnoticed before. The light drag of a sole on the polished floor, the sharp tap of something metallic against the wall, a whisper that sounded more like a password than a conversation. He took another step back, and in that gesture there was not only urgency but calculation. His eyes didn't ask you to hide, but they also didn't leave you open to exposure. It was as if he was saying, without words, that the next action, yours and his, will determine whether this story continues or whether it will be forced to change course at that very moment. The hallway, once merely an architectural element, was now the boundary line. Every sound coming from it carried the threat of revealing more than it should. You realized there were no locks capable of holding back what was about to happen. There was only the play of time and position. He adjusted his posture, chin slightly raised, shoulders squared, not to impose himself, but to disappear into his own presence. A trick of someone who knows that sometimes it's possible to be invisible not by hiding, but by becoming so much a part of the environment that no one even notices your existence. The tension wasn't just in the imminent possibility of being caught together, but in what it would represent. It wouldn't just be an inconvenience, it would be a trigger. And from the way he moved, that trigger had been cocked for a long time, waiting for just a slight oversight to go off. The sound stopped. The pause was so abrupt that your own heart seemed to slow down to keep from making a sound. You sensed that outside someone was standing, listening. The hallway, which echoed with footsteps, now felt the weight of silence. At that moment, he took the last step back, moving away from you definitively, as if physical distance were the only element capable of keeping intact something that depended on not being seen. His eyes met yours for a moment that seemed to last longer than all the previous seconds. There was no fear but a silent order for you not to move, not to speak, not to give any sign. It was the kind of command that cannot be disputed, born of the need to preserve something greater than explanation would allow. And then, suddenly, the sound returned, this time more distant. Footsteps retreating, the voice fading down the hallway, but the tension didn't dissipate. He remained distant, as if the danger hadn't gone away, merely moved. You understood, then and there, that this wasn't the time to ask. The two of you in the same space was in itself a poorly placed piece in a game that brooks no improvisation. And perhaps what bothered you most was knowing that, even without understanding all the rules, you were already on the board, in a position you hadn't chosen. If you were in her shoes, would you stand still and trust him, or would you risk opening the door to find out who was in the hallway? Her footsteps were already heading toward the door when something, almost imperceptible, caught her attention. It was the kind of detail any distracted person would ignore, but for someone with sharp instincts and a restless mind, it served as a silent alarm. The room seemed too calm, as if trying to disguise something, and precisely in that disguise she realized what shouldn't be there. On the table, next to a phone with the screen still lit, lay a photograph. It wasn't just any photo. It was of her. Not a recent, casual image, but a specific snapshot, taken at a moment she knew would never be public. That framing, that expression, even the backdrop, she'd never shown it to anyone. Her blood ran cold, but her face remained neutral. If there's one thing she's learned in life, it's that the worst weakness is letting others know you've noticed too much. She pretends not to see, keeping her body moving slowly, as if just waiting for the coast to clear. But her peripheral vision reveals more clues. Near the photo, a document with her name in clear letters rests under a loosely closed folder. She tries to control her breathing, her heart beating rapidly in time with her growing suspicion. A mental echo repeats the words he said minutes ago on the phone, the ones she only half heard. At the time, they seemed like insignificant fragments, but now they fit strangely with what's before her eyes. Her mind begins to revisit the previous scene. His tone was different, laden with an unusual, almost cutting seriousness. He'd abruptly cut off the conversation when she entered, as if he had something to hide. And now she sees it wasn't paranoia. There was something personal involved, something that directly intersected with her life. Each piece of evidence, on its own, could be explained. A photo could have arrived by mistake. A document could have been used for some bureaucratic procedure. But together, they form a much more complex picture, and not at all innocent. Her instincts begin to work like a lens, magnifying every detail. The way he positioned his body between her and the table, the quick movement to block her view of what was there, the uncomfortable silence after the phone call. Everything now seems charged with hidden meaning. She doesn't ask anything, and that's deliberate. Asking would give him control over the answer. Choosing to observe gives her the advantage of seeing how far he's willing to go without realizing he's already been discovered. As she gets closer to the door, the weight of the discovery begins to seep into her ego. Why would anyone have documents and images about her, especially materials she's never shared? It's not just curiosity that burns, but the feeling of being important enough to be at the center of something she doesn't yet understand. This fuels a dangerous mix of pride and caution. If there's a game going on, then she's somehow a key player, and knowing this changes everything. Outside, the air feels different, colder, more charged. Her mind is no longer on what she would do next, but on what she needed to discover. Those pieces of information weren't there by chance. Her name, a specific image, and that incomplete sentence she heard, together they formed the beginning of a narrative that, if revealed, could completely alter the dynamic between them. There's something deeper, an invisible layer connecting that connection to what she saw, and now there's no undoing that realization. What was once just an awkward interaction now becomes a silent turning point. She doesn't know exactly what the game is, but she already understands that she's in it, whether she wants to be or not. And perhaps this is the most unsettling and seductive part of the discovery. Realizing that someone was moving in the shadows around her, while she believed she was in control. The only thing left to decide now is whether to discreetly follow the clues or confront them immediately, knowing that any step could change the course of the story. And you, if you found proof that someone was investigating every detail of your life, would you have the nerve to pretend you didn't see it and find out more? Or would you confront them right away? He approaches slowly, as if measuring each step not by space, but by the effect it will cause. The atmosphere shifts subtly but palpably. It's no longer just a conversation. There's something between the lines, a tension that begins to creep in and spread through the air. He stops less than a meter from her, and in that moment, the silence is almost more deafening than any shout. His gaze doesn't waver, steady and controlled, but laden with a weight difficult to decipher. Then he says something, a short, unhurried sentence, but one that opens up a whole range of interpretations. It's not an explicit statement, but neither is it a simple warning. It's deliberately ambiguous. The low tone and measured cadence make each word sound as much like a promise as a threat. The words enter her mind like a puzzle, piece that doesn't quite fit. Is it an invitation to something, or is it a warning that she should stay away? Doubt is what holds her in the moment because there's no clarity. And perhaps that's exactly what he wants, to leave her suspended, her mind divided between the seduction of possibility and the chill that accompanies the presentiment of danger. As he speaks, the imaginary camera focuses on her face. There's no hiding the mix of fear and curiosity. Her eyes reveal unease, but also a flicker of fascination. Her lips, slightly parted, betray that she's about to respond, but she hesitates as if knowing that any chosen word could lead her down a path of no return. He remains still, as if handing her control of the next action, but at the same time it's clear the game is his. His posture doesn't ask for permission, but it doesn't impose either. It simply creates a space where she must decide what this moment will mean. The room feels smaller, the air warmer, and there's a strange feeling that if someone were to walk in now, they would immediately sense the tension without needing to hear anything. She tries to interpret every detail, the slight tilt of his body, the way his voice dropped a tone, the calculated pause before the last word. All of this builds a message that will only be understood if she takes the next step. The fear she feels isn't pure fear, but rather the intoxicating fear that comes with curiosity. It's the feeling of standing on the edge of a precipice, wondering what it would be like if she took a step forward. The ambiguity of what he said puts her on this fragile balance. It's a psychological test, and she knows that whatever her answer is, there will be consequences. Perhaps he's used this same tactic before with others. Perhaps it's unique to her. The fact that she doesn't know adds to the weight of the moment. As she tries to decipher it, she realizes that, deep down, it's not just the phrase that matters, but the effect he calculated it would have. He's reading her reactions, every blink, every slight movement of her chin, as if mapping an invisible territory, and this makes her even more self-aware of what she's revealing without realizing it. Silence returns, but this time it's different. It's not empty. It's a pause full of possibilities. And the worst, or the best, is that, even with the chills down her spine, there's a part of her that wants to hear more, that wants to know exactly what's hidden behind that ambiguous phrase. If it were you, faced with a sentence that could change everything depending on how it was interpreted, would you follow your curiosity or walk away out of self-preservation? She took a deep breath before touching the doorknob, as if that simple gesture were the final link connecting her to what had just happened. The hallway seemed longer than before, each step toward the exit, sounding like a silent goodbye to a part of herself that would never be the same again. Her body was there, steady, but her mind was spinning in circles, trying to piece together the pieces of a puzzle whose final image was still obscured. As she opened the door, the cool, slightly humid air hit her face, bringing an almost purifying sensation, as if inviting her to leave behind all the weight accumulated in the last few minutes. She took 2 steps outside, ready to lose herself in the distant murmur of the city and the anonymous streets that could swallow her presence without question. It was then, in the midst of this brief sense of escape, that something made her stop. Behind her, muffled by the door beginning to close, his voice came again. It wasn't the same tone he'd used moments before, when he'd been face to face with her. Now there was coldness, control, almost a veiled satisfaction. He was on the phone again, and his voice came through clearly enough to shatter any illusion of peace she might have built the moment she left. A simple phrase, but one laden with a weight that made every cell in her body react. He'd mentioned her name. Not as someone casually mentioning it, but as someone inserting it into a report, a confession, or a silent command that others would know exactly how to interpret. The sound of her own name, spoken in that context, stirred a mixture of emotions difficult to describe. It was as if reality had just ripped her from the refuge of a still confusing faith and placed her squarely in the realm where decisions shape destinies. In that moment, deep within her soul, she felt she was at the center of something that would require more than caution. It would require courage, discernment, and a faith that does not bow to the shadows. Because if the mention of her name there meant he knew more than he let on, it also meant she was in a territory where trust and danger mingled with every heartbeat. She didn't know if it was a warning, a threat, or a coded cry for help, but she was certain that her role in this story wouldn't end with that. Door closing. There was something bigger going on, and somehow her life had been woven into its fabric. What he knew could change everything. What he intended to do could determine whether she would become victim or protagonist. And it was in this tension that an inner flame began to burn. The same flame that awakens when a person realizes they are faced with a calling they cannot ignore. No matter how dark the path ahead, she knew she would need to walk it with firm steps, sustained by the certainty that the truth, however hidden, always finds a way to reveal itself. Deep down there was a verse that echoed silently in her mind, as if reminding her that, even in the darkest stories, there is a God who observes every detail, that nothing happens without his permission, and that even when everything seems like a play of hidden forces, there is an invisible purpose guiding every movement. This faith didn't diminish her fear, but rather gave it meaning. Fear stopped being paralyzing and became fuel, because perhaps the moment her name was spoken, something was consolidated in heaven, and from that moment on, her mission was no longer just to survive, but to understand what God wanted to reveal through it all. And so, as his words echoed behind the door, she continued, carrying with her the knowledge that her story had just crossed an irreversible threshold. There were unanswered questions, invisible risks, and a plot that could consume everything around her. But there was also the certainty that if she kept her faith, she would find not only answers but the strength to face whatever came. Perhaps the truth was more dangerous than the lie, but it was the truth that would set her free. And in the silence that followed, it became clear that this was only the beginning. If this scene resonated with you, like it now and subscribe so we can continue this journey together. In the next video, you'll find out what he really knows and why it changes everything.